The withdrawal of the proposed increase in VAT, the Budget Justice Coalition is calling for a national budget that prioritizes the rights and needs of all South Africans, especially in critical areas like health and education. It challenges the narrative that government must choose between social spending and economic growth, arguing that both are achievable together. Chairperson of the Budget Justice Coalition, Matshidiso Lengwasa, joins us in studio to give us more assessment on this. Matshidiso, very good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thanks for having us.
There's been mixed reaction to the court's order, given that this process has been rather complex and caused a lot of confusion. What's your assessment of this matter?
Absolutely. So you're right that I think as a country we're in unprecedented times and many of us are confused and there's a lot of chaos and a lot of politicization of what's happening. But our view as the Budget Justice Coalition is that the budget is actually an important and underutilized tool in improving the lives of the people in this country. We have such persistent levels of unemployment, poverty and inequality in our country, and we see the budget as an opportunity to redress that and to position our budget in a way that addresses that. And so we're just really calling for and continue and have been calling for officials and decision makers to use this as an opportunity to actually create a budget that works for people, that actually serves the people of this country, rather than political contestation only. Not to say that there shouldn't be political contestation, but to not reduce it to just an expensive exercise that was politicized, but actually something that can help the people of our country.
Yeah, because already the credibility of South Africa's national treasury, for one, is under scrutiny. I mean, it's had to backtrack on its budget proposals twice, and there's also been suggestions that an increase in borrowing would leave investors uneasy if that were to be the alternative, while spending cuts could be a hard sell on the political front. I mean, what considerations need to be made?
Sure. So I think that's a really important point that you've raised, because currently the discourse or the narrative is either spending cuts or a VAT increase, both of which are really harmful for economically vulnerable people in this country, but just generally everyone, especially those who rely on public services. So over the past few years, government has resorted to spending cuts, and we've seen the devastating impact of that. If you go to a health facility, clinics, you see that there are not enough doctors, and at the same time, we have newly qualified doctors that are sitting at home. Yep. Same thing with nurses and teachers as well. And so we've seen that in the past and say that that's not really working, because it is the everyday South African who has to bear the burden of poor policy making in our view. On the other hand, you have a VAT increase, which we all know would be devastating in an economy that's already, that's struggling to create meaningful jobs in that way. And so as the Budget Justice Coalition, we've been holding the line since 2018 that there are alternatives that work and that can work for the people of our country. You know, it doesn't have to be one or the other. There are creative alternatives. And, you know, during the initial VAT increase, or there were public hearings in Parliament, and 49 out of 51 proposed alternatives, including the Budget Justice Coalition. And those alternatives include looking at reserves, you know, money that's just sitting in government that's not actually being utilized to help the people in our country. We're looking at, you know, incentives such as, you know, corporate incentives that are not actually creating meaningful jobs. And of course, the most important thing is that ensuring that we actually overcome tax evasion and illicit financial flows. And in that way, you can actually see that our country does have sufficient resources. It's just about how they're allocated and how they're spent.
Some have criticized the position of no tax increases, saying that the consequences of such a position would be draconian expenditure cuts that would harm the poorest.
Sure, and our position, we still hold the line that it doesn't have to be that way. So it is true that spending cuts, if Treasury does go in that direction, would continue to disproportionately harm the most marginalized people and the most poor in our country. But like we said, there are alternatives, and we're really encouraging a move towards fiscal expansion and towards looking at the efficiency of our spending rather than looking at blunt budget cuts towards frontline services, because that would also be devastating. So really just urge people to not be shy in demanding to enough from their governments. It doesn't have to be that everyday South Africans have to bear a disproportionate sacrifice in making, in trialing budgets that work for our country. There are alternatives, and it's time for us to really move towards a direction of thinking about how do we make this budget work for people in this country in a context of such persistent unemployment and in a context of already high prices in our country. Like, how can we start reimagining our budget to be one that actually serves our people? It is actually possible, and that is our view as the BJC.
So what would be at stake here as we assess the ripple effect? I mean, you speak about the issue of unemployment. We know that as we take a bird's eye view, that has a massive impact on not only greater South Africans, but young people in South Africa who've become disheartened.
Absolutely. I think that's a strong point, that unemployment is persistent in our country, but it is the young people, our generation, that is disproportionately carrying that, because we have an economy that's not creating jobs at the rate that it should be. And in this way, our economy is effectively stealing the futures of people, because people are disheartened, they're giving up, instead of, the little that they are getting opportunities, they're getting perhaps the 370 Rand grant, the social relief of distress grants, and perhaps not even utilizing it often effectively, but utilizing it from a perspective of, but this is hopeless, there's no opportunities to create jobs, which is, I don't think that's how government probably envisioned it. And so it is really important for us to start thinking about how do we start moving away from the status quo of 30 years of unemployment, especially among young people, and start thinking about what can our budget do to better position our economy, to start creating jobs, to start incentivizing companies in a more meaningful way, not in the ways that have been ineffective corporate.
And what will that do, incentivizing those companies? What opportunity does that create?
Sure. So when we say incentivizing, we mean like in a meaningful way, not in the ways that have been done previously, which is that, for example, corporate taxes were reduced by 1%, but we don't see any investment. It is likely that those companies actually invested the savings that they got from corporate taxes internationally, and they bet on the international market rather than the people of our country. And so we need to start having conversations and bringing our fiscal policy, economic policies, and our industrial policy to come together to the fore, and come together and say, how are we actually going to address this unemployment crisis? Because our young people in this country need alternatives, because we're really just moving in a direction, like you said, of hopelessness. And that can't be that way, because we really do have a bright future and so much to offer this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming in studio to speak to us, of course, weighing in on a very crucial discussion point here. Matsidiso Lengwasa, who is the chairperson of the Budget Justice Coalition.